consoles have an illustrious history of somewhat entertaining launch games that don't make much of an impact on the generation they helped debut. Games like Rise, Son of Rome, Red Steel, or even, dare I say, Knack come to mind. Now, with the launch of the PlayStation 5, Godfall is landing somewhere in their company. It's an amusing loot-based action game with loads of choice, but a paper-thin story and a lack of variety keep it from being more than shallow fun. Godfall's story is the very definition of forgettable, barely establishing its beautifully designed world before putting you in the boots of a fallen king named Orin on the hunt to stop his brother Macros from becoming a god. It's a threadbare excuse to go fight some dudes in missions set across 3 open-world maps. Their bespoke environments really are beautiful, but while they may be visually distinct, all 3 maps are functionally identical. Basically just a series of plain circular arenas with the occasional collectible or obstacle scattered throughout. They can be fun to run through the first few times, but Godfall's missions will send you through them over and over again. Mission objectives are all incredibly similar too, with nearly every one of them being summed up as follow that waypoint, then kill this enemy. The mini-bosses at the end of most can be cool, like a huge alligator that can turn invisible or a giant mace-wielding knight, but at a certain point, Godfall starts to recycle these encounters to pad out its roughly 10-hour campaign. When it runs out of new things to show you, the repetition quickly wears thin. What keeps it going for as long as it does is that the combat itself can be very amusing. While it can certainly feel clunky at times, Godfall has loads of different combat mechanics to explore no matter which of its distinct feeling weapons you use. Some of it will be familiar, like using heavy attacks to build up an enemy's breach gauge to stagger them, but things like the Soul Shatter mechanic feel novel, essentially letting you bank part of an enemy's health bar with light attacks before triggering it for a burst with a heavy. On top of that, there's also the polarity system, which charges up the weapon you're not using and provides a buff to it if you wait long enough before switching, making my choice of secondary feel just as important as my primary. Then there's the weak point system, which adds a Fortnite-style dot to enemies for you to aim your hits at for extra damage. Layer that with dodges, a very forgiving parry, and a whole bunch of ways to modify everything with equipment, and Godfall certainly gives you a lot of interesting options. The problem is, it's all sold a bit short when you consider that on the normal difficulty setting, hacking and slashing can often work just as well, and death feels almost entirely inconsequential. And while playing an up to 3-player co-op with friends is of course a welcome inclusion, it makes this issue even more apparent as you all swing madly at whatever enemy is unfortunate enough to be in front of you. But the flashiest way to flex your playstyle preference is in your Valor Plate, a suit of armor that slightly alters your capabilities. There are 12 gorgeous options, each designed to amplify one of Godfall's other mechanics, be it Breach, Soul Shatter, or elemental ailments like Ignite, Chill, and Shock. It's fun to find synergies between Valor Plates and equipment effects, like using the bleed-inflicting Bulwark alongside weapons that deal extra damage against bleeding targets. But whether you're using Phoenix for fire damage or Vertigo for air, it doesn't functionally change much in combat. In fact, status ailments like Ignite, Chill, Shock, Poison, Bleed, and even Curse seemingly all share the same generic damage over time effect, which essentially make them and their Valor Plates little more than palette swaps. That said, weapon choice does make an impact. Using a greatsword is a very different experience from a pair of dual blades, and despite my gravitating toward the faster options, so much loot is thrown at you that I found myself content to swap fairly frequently as stronger options were picked up. I do wish it was less cumbersome to manage my loadouts across Valor Plates, but at least the weapons are all extremely cool looking. Once you beat Godfall, you'll reach its repetitive endgame mode called Dreamstones. These reuse the exact same missions from the campaign packaged into small sets as Orin explores his memories. Not that I found them very memorable in the first place. The most interesting parts of Dreamstones borrow ideas from roguelikes. They apply randomized modifiers that weaken or buff certain mechanics. You're also offered your pick of 2 different missions to complete each round, and even given a choice of temporary boons between them. That's a neat concept, but it doesn't help the fact that you're just replaying the same content you've already beaten, and that already had a variety problem before this. There are plenty of playstyle and equipment choices to tinker with, but when you're only grinding to prepare yourself for a statistically stronger version of the exact same grind, this endgame doesn't stay interesting for very long. If I hadn't been reviewing Godfall, I probably wouldn't have done more than 2 or 3 Dreamstones before losing interest. Godfall can be enjoyable and lovely while it lasts, but the repetition of its missions wears thin during its campaign, and even thinner afterwards. It's packed full of interesting decisions to make both in and out of combat, but its Valor plates aren't as mechanically diverse as they seem on their gorgeous exteriors. With neither an interesting story nor a deep pool of varied content, all the choice Godfall offers doesn't amount to much more than a bit of brief and shallow fun. For more on Godfall, watch the first 16 minutes of gameplay, or the first boss fight. And for everything else, keep it right here on IGN.